You're listening to the Valley Labor Report with David Story and Jacob Morrison.
So today, you know, as a union talk show host, a unionist myself, a lot of times, especially as people are learning more about Alabama, as people are reading your book, they find that, wow, Alabama's union density rate is actually really high. What the hell's up with that? And so they ask me, and I'm not a historian, you know, I've got a few guesses, and my guess, the thing that I kind of lean on is your work, is that the radical anti-capitalist movement was very strong in Alabama, much stronger than it was in, let's say, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee. And they really embedded themselves in the labor movement. And like you said, they were really effective. And so even if today our unions aren't particularly radical, I think, I don't think that's a stretch to say that we're not in Alabama. Our labor movement is not particularly radical, but we are kind of chugging along off of the steam that they created through their radicalism and the movement that they built. How do you feel about that as an explanation of our really it's an anomalously high unionization rate in Alabama?
Right. Well, okay. There's a long version of it, so I'm gonna give the short version of the long version because it's a really important point. First of all, one thing I've been saying, and look, I'm very happy that the struggles of the Amazon workers in Bessemer have actually convinced a lot of people to go back to hammer and hoe. But I'm always saying, I always have this cautionary tale that, look, one of the reasons that you even had a Communist Party in Alabama is because there was already a radical tradition in Alabama and in the South that goes back to South. That, you know, my teacher, Cedric Robinson, you know, basically reminded me that to understand American radicalism is to begin in the South, not to begin in New York. In other words, the story of the kind of movement of people south to sort of build a movement, no, it was already there. And the folks who came south learned from it. And so you got to go back. United Mine Workers, one of the first unions to actually have, you know, black and white, you know, leadership. Their strength was in the South, you know, in Alabama. Knights of Labor had a strong presence in the South. You know, the period after the end of Reconstruction up until the period of lynching and high lynching and disfranchisement was a period of intense class struggle in Virginia, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Georgia, Louisiana, intense. And in fact, Wilmington, North Carolina was the place where it was a working class, largely black, but interracial city that had to be, the democracy had to be overthrown through force and violence. This is one of the few places in America where there's an actual straight up coup d'etat. Right. And that's why you have so much violence in the South, not because white people are naturally violent. It's because that's what the class struggle is. You know, it's like they're trying to stop something, and they've been trying to stop it all along. So you got to go back before that. And then the last thing I'll say is that you got to go back, you got to go after that. And so even if Alabama may not have a robust radical labor movement right now, what it does have, and what's shaping this movement among the Amazon workers is a robust anti-racist movement. And so that's something that didn't end in the 1930s and 40s. I mean, at the moment when Tennessee Coal and Iron Company goes out of business, they think they shuts down in 71. There's a period of deindustrialization and Black people are struggling with service work. And you may have Black mayors like Arrington and things like that, but you still have like a Black working class struggling, right? It's also a period of heightened police brutality and racism. You have all these organizations, the Alabama Economic Action Committee, the Committee Against Police Brutality, people that have been written about by Robert Whittle's great book about Alabama, Birmingham, really in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And that period continued. So the fact that you have an organized, vibrant anti-racist movement, a movement that can mobilize so quickly in defense of Angela Davis when, you know, you had that attack on her that the Birmingham Civil Rights Museum wouldn't support.
Right.
That mobilization is proof of this long tradition that continued. And so the struggle at the Amazon plant is also an anti-racist movement. And for that, the anti-racist and labor movements come together to build a strong challenge.
I like that. I like that a lot. And that's something that if you listen to the workers that are responsible for this campaign, that's something that they'll call out a lot. And so, you said for another interview, for an article by a friend of the show, Eli Cohen in AL.com, that the RWDSU is politically, ideologically, tactically a descendant of Bessemer's International Mine Mill and Smelter Workers. What was it that made you think that?
Yeah, I did say that, huh?
That's what's in the article, anyway.
No, it is okay. True. It is true. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's a union that, first of all, I mean, the pivot from poultry workers to warehouse workers, I mean, it's a union that has a very expansive understanding of where the working class is located. It's a union that's deeply anti-racist, a union that's dedicated to civil rights, and these things are inseparable. And so when you think about the Amazon workers and how they're protesting the violence of the workplace and the way that Black workers are treated, this is what Mine Mill was doing. And Mine Mill officials, were invited. Occasionally invited some of these radicals to their own union meetings, and some of their movement members went to Highlander Folk School and trained and studied. So for them, social justice and trade unionism were inseparable. They were just inseparable, and that's Mine Mill does that, and I think the same for the RWDSU.
Yes. I think I definitely think that's the case. And you see it a lot. We've talked to some of them, and it's always something that that they try to pull out. How do you what are some other thoughts that you had, like just unprompted, like how are you working through this as it's happening, and how are you, what is it that you think of when you're seeing this happening and unfolding, and obviously having the history of having worked on Alabama's radical movement? What are some of the first things that come to your mind? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, when I read about it, the first inklings of this movement, I wasn't surprised at all. And it was in some ways a kind of redemption for, I wrote this really angry article in the Boston Review after Trump's election. It's a very short article, but part of my anger was like, don't write off the South. Don't write off the South. The South is the home of Project South, the home of song. I mean, all these organizations, the home of, now we're talking about outside of Alabama, but Jackson, Mississippi, and the Republic of New Africa and Alabama itself. I mean, this is where it was in Alabama, in Birmingham, that you begin to see the post-war period, like really intense anti-racist activity, not just in terms of the Birmingham struggles with Bull Connor, but real organizing, even beyond that, and I'm thinking about, I'm blanking out on her name, but it will come to me. But to go back to what I'm thinking about and what I see, we need this movement, especially now, because of the way that one of the most important rebellions in history, 26 million people coming out in the streets, after the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, that this movement sometimes is not seen as having any kind of class politics. I would disagree with that. It just depends, but there's a way in which it could be derailed very easily.
Right.
And so what
Amazon donated $1 million to Black Lives Matter, for example.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
you know,
and that's very, very to be expected.
right.
You know, and the corporate redirection of some of these struggles is telling. So here with the Amazon workers, it's raw. There can be no corporate, except for an alternative union and company union, there can be no real corporate takeover. And to me, it's a model of what we need. And that is real organizing that's not based solely on particular kinds of identities, but organizing that's based on the struggle for a new world. That's
right.
also deeply anti-racist, that's also deeply anti-patriarchal, that's also deeply radical in terms of the way we think about one another. So we need that. And this is, I think, a model for what's next. The question is, will it be the beginning of a resurgence of unionism? And that's hard to say because some of my best friends, people who I think of as I really have a lot of respect for, have written off unions. Written them off, saying that's old hat. We need something different, and we can't trust the white people. And I'm like, it's not about that, you know. So this is a kind of make or break moment here, and that's how I'm looking at it. And I think that it should be the centerpiece, the focus, I should say, of any understanding of where do we go from here, there, and then the struggles around. People in prison and whatnot. Right.
Yeah. And I think, you know, about RWDSU being a kind of descendant of the mine mill, that it's interesting thinking about that history, because I just learned today that, you know, regarding Biden's pro-union statement, that labor historians kind of think that was the most pro-union statement since FDR intervened on behalf of RWDSU back in the 40s for something somebody the owner wasn't agreeing to their contract that they had agreed to, and I was like, oh wow, look at RWDSU, they're really pulling the last two big presidential statements have been from RWDSU. That's pretty that they pulled that. That's pretty interesting. And you know, I don't think you're wrong about the folks at RWDSU being sort of descendants from mine mill, and actually one of the organizers that's helping to lead the effort. He told me to make sure to tell you how that there are so many RWDSU organizers that have read your book and read your work and really kind of take inspiration from it. So I'm sure that you're happy to hear that. I was happy to hear that. What would you say to them? You know, your whole book was, you said the thesis was kind of like, how do you build these multiracial working class movements? What would you say? What would your advice be to organizers, to the poultry plant workers who are members of RWDSU who are helping to organize this plant, and to the workers in the plant themselves? What would you tell them? Right. What would your advice be?
Well, you know, I mean, I'm looking to them for leadership. I mean, I think, you know, it's interesting because I don't really have good advice for them because they're doing everything you're supposed to do. They're bold and courageous. They're organizing. I think that my advice is to everybody else. You know, we live in how did Jeff Bezos make $100 billion during the pandemic? Because we bought that shit. We bought that stuff. We go online and we give them money. So it's up to us to show solidarity with the movement. It's up to us to show solidarity with poultry workers and with Amazon workers. And the way to do that is to hold on to our pocketbooks and our wallets, to basically participate and support a boycott. You know, the most success, I mean, one of the things I learned in writing Hammer and Hoe, and not just Hammer and Hoe, but almost all the work I've ever done on labor since then, which is 30 years of research and writing and talking to people and working with people, is that you've got to have a community strategy. And this is something I learned from my mentor and my friend, Eric Mann, who's here in LA. He's the founder of the Labor Community Strategy Center, who showed in the struggles to basically try to keep the Van Nuys plant in LA when it was about to leave, that you need to have a community strategy. And that means that we cannot leave those workers alone and sit back and applaud and say, oh, good work, good job. We've got to show solidarity. We've got to give them money. We've got to give the union money. We've got to build support. And building support is to hit those companies by just not giving them our money anymore, right? So that to me is extremely important because what's happening to Amazon workers is modern slavery, given the conditions of work. It is modern slavery with no protections. And we've lost so much ground since the 1930s. And the way we got that ground in the first place is through struggle. I'm sorry. If I met FDR today, I'd be like, I really, you're a nice guy, but you didn't do that because you're nice. You did that because you were forced to.
Right. Yeah. And you talked about that some folks say that, unions aren't necessary now. And you talked about how it wasn't anything that Bezos did that made him $100 billion over the course, or tens of billions of dollars over the course of the pandemic. We gave him money, and then these workers in these facilities did the work. And because we are on a conservative talk radio station, I listen to it fairly regularly. And I mean, that's one of the things that they're saying is that, the unions got greedy. And if they come in there, we're going to lose jobs here in Alabama, and they make $15 an hour. What do they want? And it's really amazing kind of the way that we've allowed these warehouse jobs, which once upon a time would have been good to support an entire family. We've allowed them to be turned into McJobs and say to the workers, oh, if you make $15 an hour, that's good enough. $15 an hour is $30,000 a year. I mean, that's not, that's not like living the high life. That's a minimum. That is an entry level salary upon which you should build significantly and quickly. And the reason that Amazon, they tout their minimum wage is because instead of their median wage is because it's basically the same. If you look at what workers are making in the Bessemer facility, their average wage is $15.30 an hour. And, I'm really heartened that the workers so quickly after getting the job are not just taking the scraps that they're being given. And I think that I also take heart that the conservative media in the state just has no idea who they need to convince, because they were talking about Biden's statement in support of them and saying, oh, well, this is good for us being anti-union because Biden being for it means any worker with any sense is going to be against it because everyone hates Biden. And it's like, that you don't know the communities that you're talking to. Like, I don't think that these communities are in love with Joe Biden, but they're not Republican communities.
Right. The
workforce is 80% black in Bessemer. The demographics, the city is 70% black,
Exactly. And it's amazing how they underestimate them. And this is also a long story. I mean, the working class generally has always been underestimated. The Black working class especially has been underestimated. And so, we just need to continue to support this work. And remember that whatever Biden says, which is great, it's fine, I'm all for good things, he's not the savior. And in fact, it would have been great if this $1.9 trillion, relief package would have had a minimum wage, package is part of it, which is so. It's like we live in. I mean, I live long enough to see our culture change, where there's such hatred for working people, and it's so deep. I mean, why do you want anyone, even people you don't like, to have to eke out a living on $30,000 a year? In 2021, that just doesn't make sense. Like, you have to be straight up evil, and these people call themselves Christians.
Right. Yeah. That the kind of bastardizing of the faith is, as somebody who is who grew up kind of that way, not particularly religious anymore, but I've been reading a lot of liberation theology and taking a lot of inspiration from these workers. You know, the lead organizer on the campaign, he used to be a youth pastor. Big Mike, the poultry plant worker from Decatur, said that he felt like God called him down there to help organize those workers. You know, I mean, the religious aspect really runs through this campaign and through this community, and it's been one of many things making me kind of reevaluate where I stand with my own faith. I'm really inspired by how they're using how their faith doesn't bring them to inaction and to saying that the poor should accept what they're given. Their faith brings them to say, I want to lift up the poor. I want to lift up the oppressed. I want to stand with them and against the oppressors. I just learned today that in the Old Testament, love your neighbor as yourself and love God are commands that are mentioned twice, but commands to love the poor are the poor, the widow, the sick. They are those commands are in the Old Testament 37 times. I mean, the preferential option for the poor is it runs deep in Scripture, and the more that I'm learning about that, and the more that I'm seeing it lived in front of me, I'm taking a lot of heart in it. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank goodness for figures like Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Steele Harris and the Poor People's Campaign. It's a reminder. And again, I'm glad you made that point, because that's another movement that almost was as massive as it was kind of under the media radar. And in some ways, it was the counterpoint to a kind of liberal rebellion that says, oh, we just want police reform, and we want to make sure that Walmart and Kmart and Petco and Amazon could kind of give us support without actually dealing with the question of what makes people vulnerable to premature death in the first place. And so I thank your show. I thank the work that you all are doing, you and David Story, amazing work. The fact that you can bring these things up on a conservative talk show.
Yeah. Well, conservative talk station. We are not.
Like on station, right?
Yes.
I appreciate that, all that work that you're doing, which is very, very important.
I thank you very much. I hope that we're able to do some good work. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback, David, but I don't have any other questions. So we've got a couple questions from the chat, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. You've been very, and just so everyone knows, I did ask Dr. Kelly how long he'd be. I'm very appreciative. He's offered to be very generous with his time. So thank you so much for willing to talk to us. Jamie asked, how do you think that the history of the communist organizing in Alabama can be incorporated into and influence tactics and direction of workers' movements going forward? And I think you've kind of hit on that, which is to not necessarily just be an economic kind of movement, to bring in these racial justice aspects, bring in the religious community, bring in the faith community, and make it a real whole community effort. Do you have anything else to kind of add to that?
No, I think that's a perfect way. I think the two things I would add to that is, and these are just old strategies: meet people where they are, not where you want them to be. And that is, you really have to listen. And the best organizers, the best communists that I studied and learned about were the ones who actually went to communities and listened to what people wanted, needed, and built on that. And then the second thing is to be improvisational. In other words, the Communist Party in Alabama was, to me, amazing by how few tracks they left behind, which is frustrating for a historian, but great for a movement. I wish you had more, but for a movement, it's really, really great. And so, meaning that in terms of the kind of union work that's being done and organizing work that's being done, not everything has to be on Twitter. Not everything has to be on Facebook. Not everything has to have likes. Some things are meant to be really underground and meant to really sort of move in stealth ways. And that's what successful organizing is about. And also, finally, education, and we did talk about this. No one became a communist from birth.
Right.
You had to learn how to think about the world differently. And we live in a world where to be a Democrat or Republican, whatever that means, requires no education. Mm-hmm. On the contrary, they try to undereducate you so that you could become one of them. Right. Whereas the party to me taught that political education is essential, that you can't just take it for granted, that oppression itself reveals the truth. When in fact, oppression sometimes shrouds it, and we've got to figure out a way to get past it. And we do that collectively and together through deep study.
That's really good. I like that. I like that a lot. Kyle had a question. Kyle has a good YouTube channel. Oh, and one of the things that I wanted to add on to is I'm a member of the IWW as well, and we host organizer trainings, semi-regularly. And one of the things that they say, as far as the meeting people where they are, is when you have one-on-ones, the IWW really stresses one-on-ones, and they say that you ought to be listening 80% of the time. And if you think you're listening the right amount, you need to listen a little bit more and talk a little bit less. And that's, I think that's really important. And David, I'm still hearing some feedback. I don't know what that's about, but it's really important to be able to actually, meet people where they are, because people aren't born communists, and in Alabama they're really not even born liberals. You've got to do a lot of work to even get folks there. Meeting people and just being okay and sitting in kind of the discomfort of somebody having a different opinion than you.
Right.
You've got to, as an organizer in Alabama, certainly in my work up here in North Alabama, there's a whole lot more white folks. So to have a good union that's capable of doing majority and supermajority actions, you're going to have to talk to conservative folks. It may not be the case so much in Amazon, but for, up here, you've got to work with these people, and you got to sit in that discomfort of them saying things that to be wrong, and help them find why that's wrong. Help bring them to that themselves.
Right. Exactly. So Kyle had a question.
Yeah, but Kyle had a question. He has a really good YouTube channel about and he does really good productions, and he's also he's a writer for the Bias magazine, the Institute for Christian Socialism's magazine. He asked if you had any advice for historians. He's a historian, and writers who wish to historicize contemporary labor organizing, like the Amazon Union, within broader histories of Southern radicalism.
Advice. Oh, that's a good question. There's so many threads, and there's so much work that was done. A lot of the best work, I think. There was a period in the 1990s and early 2000s when Robert Korstad, for example, did this amazing book on FTA. Michael Honey wrote an amazing book about Memphis. And Michael Honey's been writing a lot about the history of labor organizing in Memphis, and not just his first book, but, more recent ones about Dr. King and the garbage worker strike. There's been Tara Hunter's work on household workers. And I just think there's so much out there. And, what it taken together, Earl Lewis in their own interests, Joe Trotter's work on Southwest Virginia, and coal miners, so much work. Dan Woodruff, and Mississippi. So much. So if you take it together, what it tells us is that there's no period in Southern history that there wasn't some kind of vibrant, struggling labor movement. And these movements often connect rural and urban. Almost all of them have that relationship because of, when we think about the way people migrate and where people come from in cities, who become industrial laborers, they have this connection to the countryside. And so to think more broadly of the South, not as the countryside or the city, but as a kind of combination of both, to know that militant tradition and to be reminded over and over again that there are amazing examples of multiracial unity and solidarity. There's a way in which the South gets written off as hopelessly racist, and therefore Jim Crow makes it impossible to even imagine any kind of space that's a multiracial space. And I think that the tradition of scholarship that I'm mentioning actually gives that lie, right? It exposes something different. And then finally, in terms of historicizing the moment, the most important advice I guess I would give is to just remember the more recent history, to really, really dig into that. Like I said before, I mean, we can go back to the 30s always, because it's kind of a grand period. But I'm like, what about Greensboro in the 90s when they had a campaign against Kmart and a campaign where they were able to, through their work with city council and through many of the survivors, like Nelson Johnson and others, to organize to basically get a living wage legislation passed in Greensboro. And this is after, years after the massacre. So even in the 1990s and 2000s, there's vibrant labor moments. Danny Glover, my really good friend, always talks about the Nissan. In fact, Danny went to Alabama in solidarity with, but Danny always talks about the work that he did with the Nissan workers in Mississippi. And that's recent. So we have a recent history that hasn't been told yet, of the continued, against all odds, struggles of the working classes in the South.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the people that are doing the work, organizing these Amazon workers, of course, they're doing a lot of the work. But, these poultry plant workers didn't come out of nowhere. They've been organized for years. Maybe it'd be good to talk to, to hear some of their stories or read up on what their unions have been doing. That's something that I want to dig into more myself.